In the second half of this lesson, we're going to apply what we just learned to an event that happened in roughly the year 1700 BCE. The book of Genesis offers timeless historical lessons, such as the importance of resilience and leadership. One striking example is Joseph, who rose from slavery to lead Egypt during a severe famine. His story illustrates the value of integrity, wisdom, and forgiveness as he managed resources to save nations, which is the narrative you get from Genesis. From an economics perspective, however, a closer examination of this history raises a provocative question. Was the tax Joseph implemented to save Egypt from famine actually a catalyst for the crisis that he foretold? This perspective aligns with the argument presented in this article here. The people are reduced to serfdom. That article is published on the Daily Cost. As you read through this article, you're going to get a different take on this story in Genesis. I'll leave that to you. When Pharaoh Amenemhat III put Joseph in charge of the Egyptian economy in circa 1700 BCE, agriculture was by far the largest component of national output, with most of the population living near subsistence levels. Fearing Joseph's foreseen famine, the state, headed by Pharaoh, but under Joseph's direction, taxed farm output at 20%. Assuming agricultural production equaled the amount consumed and saved, the tax would have reduced the amount of consumed and privately saved grain by 20%. The subsistence level of annual total grain consumption would be about 450 million pounds. And the way I get to 450 million pounds, I had to make several assumptions. We're assuming that there were 1.5 million Egyptians living in Egypt at the time. The average Egyptian consumed about 13.15 ounces of grain, which equates to 1,000 calories per day. One seed produced an average of 10 seeds. Planting 50 million seeds then would have produced the self-sustaining 500 million pounds, because we're going to multiply 10 times 50 million, which would be 500 million pounds. Now, how do we get to the 450 million? Well, we're going to multiply 1.5 million Egyptians by 13.15 ounces per day per Egyptian. And we're going to convert ounces to pounds, 1 pound per 16 ounces, 365 days per year. And that is going to get us to 450 million pounds if we round to 0 decimal places. So over in Excel, I'm going to type 1.5 million, 13.15 ounces per Egyptian per day, 1 pound per 16 ounces, and 365 days per year. So the way this works is you cancel the word Egyptian because it shows up in the top row and in the bottom row. The bottom row is where we're dividing. The top row, we're multiplying. So we're going to divide Egyptians by Egyptians. That goes away. Ounces divided by ounces goes away. Day and day, those cancel. And so we're going to multiply 1.5 times 13.15 times 365, and then we're going to divide that by 16. So over here, I'm going to type 1.5 million times 13.15 ounces per day times 365 days per year. We're going to divide that by 16 because 1 pound is 16 ounces. We're going to press enter. And when we round to 0 decimal places, we get 450 million pounds. That's where we got to 450 million pounds up here. That would be subsistence level grain consumption. So they need to grow 500 million pounds, save 50 million pounds each year. So the next year they can grow 500 million pounds. And we're assuming that the population remains constant. We're pulling the ceteris paribus assumption here. Now, if we think of pulling 50 million pounds of grain from the 500 million pounds that are harvested every year, we're setting that 50 million pounds of seed aside to be planted next year. That means the savings rate would have been 10%, because 10% of 500 million is 50. Annual production, annual grain consumption, and annual grain saved would have remained at blank, blank, and blank million pounds respectively had Joseph's tax not been imposed. So grain production would have remained at 500, assuming everything else is held constant through time. Which is a big assumption, but sometimes we have to make those assumptions to do an analysis. Grain consumption would have continued at 450 million, and annual grain saved for production the following year would have been 50. So as long as the climate remains constant, there are 1.5 million people to feed in Egypt every year, and they are consuming 1,000 calories per day, and each seed produces 10 seeds. Then without the tax, this would have been the case. Now we're going to impose the tax. So in the years 1769 BC, 1768 BC, 1767 BC, we have this steady state equilibrium where 50 million pounds of seed are being planted every year. That's producing 500 million pounds of grain. The tax is not implemented yet, so zero is being taken by government, be put into storehouses. So the after-tax quantity remains 500 million for these years. The savings is 50 million pounds, and that leaves 450 million for consumption. But in the year 1766 BC, Joseph puts in its tax. Okay, so in the first year of the tax, what happens? Joseph orders 20% of the 500 million to be taxed. So that the state, under Joseph's direction, takes 100 million pounds out of circulation and puts that in a warehouse throughout Egypt and then locks the doors. That leaves 400 million after tax. And since the savings rate is 10%, Egyptians know that they got to save 10% of their harvest. In this case, after-tax harvest. So they're going to save 40 million pounds for next year's harvest. And they're going to consume 360 million pounds, divided into 1.5 million people, means they're not getting 1,000 calories a day anymore from the grain. So the tax started to squeeze their diets on average. Now, the very next year, 40 million pounds are planted. That produces a crop of 400 million pounds. But the state takes 20% of that, and 20% of 400 is 80. That leaves an after-tax quantity of 320 million pounds. Assuming the savings rate remains constant, Egyptians save 32 million pounds of grain to be planted the following year. So consumption drops to 288 million pounds. And this continues in the year 1764, 1763. So what we're going to finish off this table. I'm going to copy this table to Excel. So notice that the amount planted is the amount saved. So this value is going to be the 20.48. In this year, 1763 BCE, 20.48 million pounds of grain is stored because historically the people of Egypt saved 10% of their harvest for the next season and then they consumed the rest. Now we're going to multiply each one of these grain seeds, each one of these kernels of grain is going to produce 10 by assumption. So we're going to multiply that quantity by 10. The state's going to take 20% of it or multiply it by 20%. So this is how much the state confiscates. That leaves the difference. So 163.84 remains to be consumed and saved. Then we're going to multiply this by 10% because that's the historical amount that people in Egypt saved for the next harvest, leaving the difference in these two for consumption. Now today, this is probably not a likely scenario because our economy is not 80%, 86%, 90% agricultural. Agriculture makes up a very small percentage of our economy today. Also, most Americans are not living at subsistence levels. Most Egyptians were living at subsistence levels. Then all I got to do is drag this down to the year 1760 BCE. And we want two decimal places. So I'm going to change this, all these numbers to decimal places here. I already have the year 1763 done. I need these numbers inserted into these answer boxes. While I'm doing that, I'm going to put the video on pause. When I get to the end, and I've entered all these values in this table, I'll restart the video. I've entered the values in this table. Looks like we got all the answers correct. We're going to use the values in the table to answer some of the remaining answer boxes. At the end of 1766 BCE, the year Joseph's tax began, 100 million pounds of grain were taxed and locked in government warehouses. Assuming the above savings rate, 40 million were saved by the people of Egypt because there was 400 million pounds after the tax. And that left 360 million pounds of grain for consumption. In the seventh year of the tax, at the beginning of 1760 BCE, the tax had reduced annual production to how many millions of pounds? 130.07. 26.21 million pounds of that are taxed and locked in government warehouses. 10.49 million pounds of grain are saved by the people of Egypt because they saved 10% of their harvest after the tax. And only 94.37 million pounds of grain are consumed. Assuming the population remains at 1.5 million for all 7 years, according to the above table, the average Egyptian consumed how many pounds of grain annually prior to the tax and how many pounds per year after the 7th year of the tax. 1767 BCE, 450 million pounds. So I'm going to multiply that by a million. Well, that's 450 million. I'm going to divide by the 1.5 million people in Egypt. Each Egyptian is consuming about 300 pounds a year because most Egyptians live at subsistence levels. If I drag this down, we're going to see what happens to the average amount of grain Egyptians are getting each year. By the seventh year of the tax, consumption per Egyptian is down to 63 pounds per year. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and blanked to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So you can find that here in this verse of the New King James Version. The word that needs to be entered in the answer box is the word sold. Joseph didn't give away the grain, he sold it. In the first year of the famine, Joseph sold the Hebrews grain for all the blank that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan. I'm going to copy this and look for that. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan. So he's allowing all the people of Egypt and Canaan to buy the grain from him
at the monopoly price.
In the second year of the famine, Joseph brought them through that year with food in exchange for all their what? This can be found in Genesis 47:17 of the NIV, livestock. So they didn't have any money left. So Joseph is still selling this grain that the government has monopolized. Because they're out of money, he's selling it to them for exchange of their livestock, which means the people of Egypt no longer have goats or cows to milk. In the third year of the famine, the Hebrews begged Joseph, buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be blank to Pharaoh. We're going to find that in Genesis 47:19 of the NIV. Here's 19. Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So they're selling themselves as slaves. So they agree in the third year to be the slaves of Egypt. I'm not saying Joseph is a bad guy. Maybe Joseph believes he is a good guy and he sees this famine. He proposes a tax. As we've learned in economics, well-intentioned policies have consequences, and some of those consequences are negative. Is it possible this tax is the thing that led to the famine? Is it basically a self-fulfilling prophecy? And that famine led to the bondage of the Hebrews in Egypt. Suppose the market share of any single farmer in Egypt was 1% in the years before and after Joseph's tax. Now, that's a big assumption, but it makes calculating the Herfindahl Index very easy because 1 squared is 1. So it's a very simplifying assumption. Assume there's only 100 farmers, right, which is not the case. So that's another simplifying assumption to make the math easier. At the end of 1760 BCE, the government of Egypt had a total of blank million pounds of grain. We have to sum this column. This is how much they were storing as a result of the tax. They had almost 400 million pounds of grain sitting in government warehouses. And those government warehouses are locked. And when Joseph opens the warehouses, he doesn't give it away, he sells it. So we're going to round that to 0 decimal places. I'm going to type 395 here. Farmers, on the other hand, had a total of how many pounds? After tax, the quantity is 104.86. And this is for consumption, sale, and planting. The government's market share is what then? I'm going to type equal here. The size of the market is what? The sum of these two. 500 million. That's really interesting, right? The market share of the Egyptian government is this number divided by the 500 million. And we're going to turn it into a percent by multiplying by 100. And we're going to get rid of the decimal places. So the market share of the government is 79%. The 4-firm concentration ratio would be what? Remember what the 4-firm concentration ratio is? It's the 4 largest market shares summed. So we're assuming that all farmers in Egypt have a market share of 1%, and the government has a market share of 79. So the top market share is the government, and then everybody else is tied. So the 4-firm concentration ratio is just the sum of these 4. At the end of 1760 BCE, before the government monopolized agriculture, each farmer had 1% market share. So the top 4 would each have 1% market share. And the 4-firm concentration ratio was 4 before the tax, and then 82 at the end, 7 years of the tax. The Herfindahl Index before the tax was what? Well, here we have to write 1 100 times. That's 100. So we have 100
ones because we were asked to assume each farmer had 1% market share.
So the Herfindahl Index in this case is the sum product as we did before. As we did before, the sum product of these ones with these ones. So we're multiplying the 1 by itself and we're adding all 100 of those up. And we get a Herfindahl index of 100, right? Because 1 squared is 1. We add up 100 of those and we get 100. That's our Herfindahl index before the tax. Okay, after the tax, we have what? The government has a market share of 79, and we're just assuming everybody else has 1%. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this across. So now it's 6340. Why? Because we're squaring the 79, and then we're adding that to 1 squared, and we have 99 of those 1 squareds, and we get 6340. We got this marked wrong because we made an error in our simplifying assumptions. If you look at this column, the government has 79% market share.
If each farmer has 1% market share,
Then what we're going to have to do is we're going to delete some of the farmers from the second column. And let me show you what I mean by that. If we sum these ones, we should get 100 because we have 100 farmers, each with 1% market share. This row here is market share. And this right here is the Herfindahl Index, HI. If I drag this over, this should be 100 as well. So what we have to do is we have to make this 100 by deleting a bunch of these ones here. We want to delete enough ones until that market share is equal to 100. Looks like we deleted too many of them. Okay, so now we have how many firms are left? 21 farmers and then the state. That's one of the problems with the assumption we're making, right? That each farm has 1% market share. Okay, so with all the market shares in both before and after equal to 100, now we can calculate the Herfindahl Index. And the Herfindahl Index is the sum product of this column. So we're multiplying 79 times itself. We're multiplying 1 by itself in each of these rows. And then we're summing those products. And we're multiplying nothing by itself in these rows, which is 0 numerically. And we get the correct Herfindahl Index being 62. I'm not saying that Joseph purposely caused the famine. Perhaps Joseph truly believed the famine was coming, and he did what he thought was right, imposing a tax on agriculture so that the government could store up all this grain and then provide it to the people when the famine comes. They didn't give it away for free. They were selling it at monopoly prices. And when the people ran out of money, they had to give up their livestock. They had to give up their land. They had to give up themselves and be bonded to Pharaoh for 400 years as slaves. So the moral of the story is, we'll assume that Joseph's intent was to do good. But as we've learned in economics, there are consequences to policy interventions. And sometimes those consequences are quite negative. And the consequences of this policy resulted in a famine. It resulted in the monopolization of agriculture by the government of Egypt, the monopolization of dairy, because all the farmers, all the people of Egypt had to give up their goats and cows, they had to give up their livestock to buy grain. And it resulted in a monopoly in labor, unpaid slave workers. It's a really good historical lesson. Just because some policy sounds good, we need to carefully weigh the negative consequences against the benefits of the policy.